we're going to talk about the big old beast, travel insurance. And I know you got different people from different camps. Oh, I put all this money in travel insurance and I don't even get anything out of it. Like, why don't I just save money? And should I use this? Should I do that? Like, this happened. I thought it was going to be covered, but it wasn't. It's a confusing time, this travel insurance thing. So we're going to break it down. We're going to unravel it. We're going to think about it. I'm going to tell you a story about Israel that has nothing to do with travel. A little bit to do with travel insurance, and it's important for a certain thing to be mindful of before you go on a trip. So this one's going to talk about the concept of safetravel.gov.nz and also the media outlets. So travel insurance, just like any insurance, the house always wins. So they're going to calculate, they're going to scheme, they're going to try and work out, how do I make money off this and how do I provide a good service to the clients? Because you actually want them to win more times than they lose, because if they don't win more times than they lose, they won't be able to pay you. And we want them to pay you, ideally. So one of the things to be mindful of, if you knowingly go traveling overseas into a place that's been deemed as unsafe, either by media or by safetravel.gov.nz. So it's a website provided by the government. You can check where you go. Now, this relates to Israel is because I was there when Donald Trump, some might like him, some might not, seems to be a very divisive person, but he was deciding to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He was talking about it in the media, and that really upset Hamas. So you could view Hamas as a terrorist organization or a liberating force. I'm not sure your view, but they promised to open the gates of hell on Israel. So they were saying, hey, in Jerusalem, we're going to make sure that you guys go through all the suffering because of the silly things that Donald Trump has said. And that was when I was there in Tel Aviv, and I wanted to go to Jerusalem, and I was only there for like a few weeks. So I didn't want to miss out on the opportunity to see the place. And there was actually a national warning. When I looked on the Safe Travel website, it says, hey, I should stay away from there. It also advised US citizens that they should actually leave the country because it's a dangerous time to be in that area. Now, I went anyways, had fun, made friends with the taxi driver. He was one of the original Israelis from the 60s. And we sort of got around using his pass from the military to get in these little spots. And there was no lines, and it was pretty cool. So that's something to be mindful of with travel insurance, is that if you're about to go somewhere, they want to make sure it's safe. So you need to be mindful of when you take out the cover, you're open, you're transparent, because what we've learned in the other episodes around insurance is the two main things that are most important is you want to act with the utmost good faith. So you got to be honest and transparent, and you got to have an insurable interest, and that's across all insurances. So now let's look at other things you might want to be mindful of. Let's look at like top tips. So if you're going to buy travel insurance, one of the things to be mindful of is reading the policy wording. You'll hear slick people running out of breath, promising you the world, but the wording doesn't coincide with what they're actually saying. And the bottom line is the wording is what will determine whether you get covered or not. So always read the policy wording. The other thing are the common exclusions that they have in the policy. So you might make the assumption you're covered for certain things, but in reality you're not. So you always want to look at what the exclusions are. And quite often as well with travel insurance, they have a 24-hour emergency assistant team. You want to make sure that's saved. So if something happens, you need the level of cover, you need something to be covered, then you can call them immediately and you have everything you need. The other thing is you might have the intention of buying high-value items. So in, what's the place? Bali. Someone told me you can get cheap gold there. And I don't know, like, is it even gold? Why is it cheap? But let's say you're going to get a high value item. Sometimes there's a limit on what will actually be covered. So you want to make sure for those high value items, you're checking how much of the limit is limited to. That's another thing. The other thing that catches you out is, in New Zealand and around the world, a lot of people crash. And if the house wants to win, the insurance company wants to make sure that they don't pay out more than what they make, then they're going to have to be wary of those certain things. So with vehicle insurance, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to try and get covered through your travel insurance for that. It's actually better to go to the rental company itself, let's say you're overseas, you buy a little tuk-tuk in Thailand, you might be better off getting the rental insurance that they provide. So if there's damage to either external property or to the car or to another car, then it's covered. Whereas if you use your travel insurance, they'll try and get out of it. They don't necessarily like to include it in their policy. So it's better to actually go direct to the rental company in that instance. Another valuable thing to do is shop around. I mean, it's overrated. We say it a lot, but you always want to make sure that the policy makes sense for you. Take, for example, if you're a sporting sort of person or adventurous and you're going to go do bungee jumping, skydiving, these high-risk events. Arguably, I don't think they're high risk, but in New Zealand, something horrible happened in the minnow too. There was bridge swinging. They didn't even tie the rope to the other end, and the lady passed away. So things can happen if you don't have the right measures. So you want to be transparent and utmost good faith with the insurance provider and say, I'm about to do these activities. Are they covered? And you just want to look through those exclusions and what may be covered and may not be covered. That's why it's useful to shop around to see what makes the most sense. The other thing is if you're over 65, well, once again, you're at the risk of having a more serious health condition. So they might be apprehensive about the cover they provide you. And one way around that is you can be transparent about your medical history and they can request that. And just be mindful that pre-existing medical conditions as part of basic packages are quite often not included. There are exceptions where there are automatically covered pre-existing medical conditions. But you always just want to be upfront and transparent with them about, hey, I've had this issue. And it's not just about actually being diagnosed with it, but if you've actually seen a doctor and you showed that you had symptoms, then they might find a reason not to pay out as a result. So those are some mindful tips that you should think about when you're actually being covered by the insurance. The main things they cover for is usually medical treatment. So if you really hurt yourself, they cover that. They also may cover the transportation of you back to your homeland if it's an emergency. Certain types of emergencies they cover. The other thing is if there's a cancellation or a loss of deposit, they'll cover you for that. Obviously, it depends on each policy, but usually that's the case. Also, if you lose your luggage, once again, be mindful of the high value limit that you might be covered. And then also personal liability. So if you do something you shouldn't, then you're covered for the liability you inflicted on someone else. The two things to be mindful of that is, once again, the vehicle insurance. The house always wins. They don't necessarily cover you for that. The other thing is, let's say you have Airbnb or stay at a hotel and you damage the property. They usually don't cover that. There are some exceptions. So you actually either be mindful not to break things, or usually the place that you're staying has some level of insurance and they have like a deposit to protect against that if you were to damage it, or a bond of sorts. And that's the general gist. Another thing you might have realized and heard a lot about is COVID. So they're like, oh, well, I had a cancellation, and in my policy it says the cancellations are covered, but it was because of COVID. Why aren't they paying for it? Well, the insurance companies have done all the statistics. They've all thought of all the different things, and pandemics and epidemics aren't something new, so they actually exclude that in their policy. There are some policies that provide treatment for COVID. They've adapted. They've been aware that there's a bit of a stigma around public perception and fear of using insurance, so they've included it as an added benefit. But as a general rule of thumb, if there's a serious epidemic or pandemic and that leads to a certain cost that's incurred on you, then they're not likely to cover that, and that's usually excluded in the policy. So there are different things and different parts, and you really want to shop around, and there's some good websites that you can use that I'll include in the description, just to get a feel for what's the right cover for you. But the main thing is be completely open and transparent. Share your journey, what you're going to do. Have an open discussion with the provider, and cheaper doesn't always mean better. Make sure that the policy is covering what you expect it to cover before you go. And you can get domestic cover as well. Like they might cover you for rental car, the excess. So if something happens, there is some level of cover for New Zealand. The other thing they might cover, same thing, cancellation. or delayed flights, loss of luggage, and New Zealand, they might cover you for the personal liability. So same sort of concept, except they're a little harsher on the medical treatment that you might be covered, because in New Zealand, they have the Accident Compensation Scheme, ACC, where if you hurt yourself and it's serious, you go to the public health sector. But if you had something that might be not covered by the public health sector, then they'll be mindful not to have that in the policy. So that's what they do with the domestic insurance. So yeah, that's travel insurance. There is something that I wanted to include, but I can't fucking remember it. So I'm letting the team down, but that's the idea. So if you felt that was valuable, if there was something else you felt like I missed, leave it in the comments section. If you can give us a review or subscribe to the YouTube channel. Anyone that's listening on Apple, for example, if you give us a rating, it just means more people have the opportunity to actually learn these sort of things, so they don't end up in a position they didn't expect, and we can all have a better financial future as a result. So yeah, that's the idea. That's travel insurance. There's one thing, I swear to God, there's one thing that I'm missing. Or maybe we can pause this and I'll tell you that answer. And that final piece that I was thinking of is if you're a non-resident. So if you're a non-resident of New Zealand insurers do not want to cover you, except for two cases usually, which is if you're a seasonal worker or you're an international student. So I should have known that off the top of my head. I let you down, but that was the piece of information I was missing. So thank you for listening, and I genuinely hope that that was useful for you and you can implement it. It's one thing to hear, it's another thing to do it.